these truths to be self-evident.
That all men are created equal.
As a member of Congress, I get to have a lot of really interesting people in the office, experts on what they're talking about.
This is the podcast
For insights into the issues.
China, bioterrorism, Medicare for all, in-depth discussions.
Breaking it down into simple terms. We hold
these truths
with Dan Crenshaw.
The Eagle has landed.
All right, welcome back, folks. Got Brian Riedl here. Riedl, right? Brian, how do I say your name? Riedl?
Riedl.
Okay, I got
It's
it totally
fine.
wrong. So we're going to talk about the debt. We're going to talk about some of the misconceptions about the debt, what we might expect from some of these bills, what the long-term effects might be, what people on the ground should be actually worried about. The debt, unfortunately, I think continues to be less and less important to average Americans because they've been told the sky is falling for literally decades, and it never quite falls. So that's, I think, as a result, people have just stopped worrying about it. But this is an issue that you focus on quite a bit. You're at the Manhattan Institute right now. I focus on budget, tax, and economic policy. Previously worked as the chief economist for Senator Rob Portman, staff director at the Senate Finance Subcommittee on Fiscal Responsibility and Economic Growth. You've done a lot of things. I'm not going to read the whole bio if that's okay. You've been at Heritage Foundation. You've worked on Rubio's presidential campaign, written a lot of stuff, know a lot of things. So thanks for being on the podcast to talk about this important issue. Where do we begin? How about I think we've laid enough criticism on the Biden lie that the reconciliation bill, the Build Back Better agenda, costs nothing, costs $0. I think people get that intuitively. So I don't know if I want to beat that dead horse, but maybe you can talk about some of the budget gimmicks and what budget gimmicks even are when we look at bills like this, and what people should be looking out for.
Sure. One of the issues is Democrats are trying to cut the cost of this reconciliation bill from $3.5 trillion to $1.5 trillion. Now, one way to do that would be to actually get rid of provisions. But instead, what they're saying is, well, instead of doing $3.5 trillion over 10 years, we could just do $1.5 trillion over 4 years. That way, you're still doing the same programs. You're just going to do it for 4 years instead of 10. And then the issue is, at the end of 4 years, the programs are already in place. So you basically dare Congress to actually let them expire. It's like a drug. You get people hooked, and then you dare them to cut them off. So what they're doing, for instance, they're just putting in a 1-year extension of the expanded child tax credit, $130 billion a year. In reality, the point is to keep it for 10 years and spend $1.3 trillion. Similar Medicare expansion, child care, Obamacare, family leave. Once you create it, the idea is you'll expand it later. And that way, a bill that looks like it's going to cost $1.5 trillion really ends up costing $4 or $5 trillion over 10 years.
So, can we just focus on the child care tax, or the child tax credit, for a little bit? It's an interesting one. It's a good little political football for the Democrats. I mean, this was a Republican idea, right? A kind of a pro-family idea. Now, obviously, you can take these, just because $1 spent on something is good doesn't mean $10 more is good. This is a lesson that Democrats never want to learn. But can you talk to us about the economics of that particular bill? Because look, there's an increasing number of Republicans. They might call themselves populists. I hate that. But these ideas aren't crazy, right? That our policies, it shouldn't just be an ideological loyalty to everything must be free market at all times, every time, right? There can be policies that encourage family growth and that make it easier for a hardworking family to have kids and afford their mortgage. This is not crazy policy. That's kind of where the child care tax credit comes from. But can you talk to us about the trade-offs associated with that, and what is too much? What are the Democrats changing in this that make it bad?
Right. The issue is the child tax credit was originally $500 when it was created in the 90s by conservatives. It grew to $1,000 under President Bush, then $2,000 a couple of years ago. And now the Democrats are pushing it to $3,000 per child, or $3,600 if you have a child under 6. We all want to help families with children. We want families to be able to afford to take care of children. And we want people to be able to afford having kids, because having kids also, forget the social aspect, there's also an economic benefit to having children that we want to compensate families for. The concern is if the child credit gets huge and you start to get up to, a family of four getting $14,000, $15,000 a year, you start to run into work incentives. You start to run into the issue of families getting huge checks from the government that's no longer tied to work, which then kind of gets you back into the welfare mess we had in the 70s and 80s before the welfare reform in 96, where you're just paying people huge amounts for having kids. There's also the angle that historically, the child credit has been somewhat tied to work, which is to say it's supposed to be an offset of your taxes. They're kind of getting rid of that. And now, even if you have no taxable income, you just get a check, which means it's no longer even really part of the tax system. It's really just a subsidy.
Yeah. And are they also changing who's eligible for it? Are they, because are the wealthy going to be eligible for this?
Yes.
Potentially tens of thousands of dollars of tax credits?
Yeah, this used to be something for families with lower incomes, a middle class policy. Now it's going to be going up, possibly, families up to $200,000, $250,000 a year are going to earn this. The reason they're doing that is twofold. A, to make it more popular. You buy more votes, the more people you make eligible. But also B, because they're trying to avoid a cliff. They're trying to avoid a situation where you go from $99,000 a year to $100,000 a year and you lose the child tax credit. That would create a cliff where families would actually be facing a huge punishment or marginal tax hike from their income going up. So in order to deal with these phase out cliffs, they're saying just give it to everybody up to about $250,000 a year, which is one of the reasons it's really expensive. This expansion alone would cost as much as the 2017 tax cuts.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but I think your average American doesn't think it's fair that somebody who makes $200,000 or $300,000 a year needs any help at all. They don't. That's ridiculous. But the conservatives still have to have an answer to that problem, because it is a real problem, right? The cliff that somebody falls off of, and it doesn't matter what welfare program you're talking about. There's a disincentive to people if they're really doing the math, if they're really looking at what kind of benefits they're getting and how those benefits stop if they take that higher paying job. What's your opinion on that? How should conservatives be talking about that particular policy set?
I think in a way it's kind of inevitable. If you're going to have anti-poverty programs for lower middle class, you're faced two options. It has to stop. You either have to have a huge budget cost and have it go to everyone, or you have to make it stop. And the place where it stops on the margin is often, it's not that somebody's going to stop going to work because of the child tax credit. What ends up happening is it more becomes a barrier if, say, a second spouse wants to go to work or not. You do the math. How much money am I going to pay in taxes? How many benefits am I going to lose? And the second pairing goes, this just isn't worth it. The marginal benefit isn't that great. And I do think, some of this is just inevitable. I think conservatives understand there should be some benefit and some compensation for the cost of raising kids. But again, the bigger you make it, the more cliffs you have, and also just the bigger taxpayer cost, especially when you're subsidizing the middle class. That's $1.3 trillion that could be used for a lot of other purposes, a lot of which is going to be going to upper middle class families that really don't need it.
How does it work right now for the child tax credit? How is it means tested?
Right now, the tax credit slowly fades out. I don't have the numbers in front of me, but it slowly fades out at rates of like 20 to 30 cents per dollar at a certain point. So if your income goes up $1, you lose 20 cents of benefits until it phases out to zero.
Right. So it's not a hard cliff, but it is graduated, which it seems to make the most sense. It's probably the best way that you can avoid that disincentive to work that we worry about. Maybe staying on the subject of taxes for a second, what's in the news today is Democrats really pushing for this wealth tax. Speak to that. This has been tried before. It tends to drive, I think in France, tends to drive out wealth. People just put their money somewhere else because, it's not as clear cut as income, and how you would tax that. And so maybe talk about the consequences of that. Is it really going to get the Democrats what they want, right? Is it really going to get this sort of paying of their fair share? And there's not a terrible argument there that they make with somebody like Jeff Bezos, who deliberately doesn't take a paycheck. Some of these guys, I mean, even I think what they do is they borrow from them. They basically take out loans that they use as spending money, and then they can actually, and obviously if it's a loan, you're not paying taxes on it. So it's these really tricky mechanisms that allow them to avoid taxation at all. Kind of seems to me that there should be a CEO minimum wage, but I don't know if that's a better idea. The question is, how much should that minimum wage be? But maybe speak to the trade-offs associated with that conversation.
Sure. There's different wealth taxes Democrats are looking at. There's one that would just do what Europe abandoned, which is to say, if you're worth over $50 million or $100 million a year, we're just going to take what, according to Bernie Sanders, 8% of your wealth every year. Which, for all the support of that idea, I understand most of that money is going to come out of the stock market where they actually have the wealth, and you're going to have huge drops in stock market wealth. That's going to affect everyone's 401k. There's also what's called mark-to-market taxation, which is what Democrats are writing a bill on right now, which says if your investment portfolio goes up in a given year, you're going to pay taxes on that, whether you actually cash it out or not. There's a couple of crazy aspects of mark to market. First off, nobody in the world does this. It's insane. But you're not taxing actual income. You're taxing theoretical income that the person hasn't even received yet. So a couple problems are, let's say, according to Wyden, there's going to be a one-time look back on all of your capital gains. So if I started a business that's now worth $1 billion, I'm going to get a $238 million tax bill. How am I going to pay that?
Retroactively?
Retroactive $238 million tax bill. How am I going to pay that without selling my business? Because you haven't actually cashed it out yet. Because it's going to apply retroactive. Also, if you're going to pay taxes during the years you go up, then the years the stock market drops, the government is going to be writing billion-dollar checks to these people, because when it drops, you're going to have to pay them money to balance it out. So imagine a recession when the government is already bleeding money, and now you're writing tens of billions of dollars of checks to Fortune 500 CEOs. Finally, there's just the issue of how is the government even going to value everything all these people own every year? How do you value privately held businesses, art, yachts? The IRS is going to basically have to move into these people's houses. It's a wacky concept. I can't believe they're even considering it.
Yeah, and it gets to the point. It's hard to figure this one out. Because again, I go back to, look, we're all mad at Jeff Bezos for avoiding personal taxes. Now, the flip side of that is this guy responsible for creating hundreds of thousands of jobs and more tax revenue than anybody else? I mean, yeah. But it annoys people that he doesn't pay any income tax, and it is annoying. But the question is, what's the right, how many principles do you have to violate to get him to pay that, and what are the consequences? And like, I was only half joking about a minimum wage for CEOs. I mean, I think I'm actually, again, it's a little tough because it's, what's the right number? And really, what are we getting at it? Let's say we make them get paid $1 million a year. So what do we really? Okay, good, great job. We got another $500,000 into the federal coffers. Not exactly a big deal, but I mean, it's worth having those discussions because it does make people upset. Now, is it an irrational feeling? Yeah, kind of. It's more about resentment than it is sound policy. But, unfortunately, I'm in politics and I have to deal with people's emotions on these things. And it's at least worth having an answer. I don't know. I don't know if you want to expand on that. I'm kind of just thinking out loud.
Yeah, I get the concern. I mean, Amazon Amazon itself, does pay taxes most years, despite what you may read in the Washington Post. Most years they do pay taxes, and the years they don't, it's because they're taking tax preferences that Congress gave them for things like R&D that they're an investment that they're supposed to be encouraging. But I get the anger. I think there are ways to tax CEOs better than we do now. Things like the fact that right now, if you build up capital gains your whole life, you pay taxes on it when they're sold, but if you die, you pass it down to your heirs tax-free without them having to ever pay tax. You could argue that that's a loophole, that there's no reason that money should permanently escape taxes as long as the person dies, wipe the slate clean. But it's also important to note, as you mentioned, you're not going to fix the budget by taxing billionaires. You could, if you seized every penny of every billionaire in America, the government just went in and seized everything they own, it would finance the federal government for 8 months total. And then at the end of that, it's gone. And by the way, your 401k is gone too, because their wealth was in the stock market. If you seized everything Jeff Bezos owns, you'd finance the government for about a week. And so that's not to say that they shouldn't be paying their fair share or that you can't raise taxes. I'm not trying to create an either or, but it's important to manage expectations that you're not going to be able to pay for that much that we want to do by taxing them. We have to be realistic about what we can raise.
Yeah. And it's worth noting the Scandinavian countries that the Democrat socialists like to point to, they do figure out how to raise that revenue, and it's through their middle class taxes that people pay very high tax rates. They're much higher than we pay here. Let's talk about the debt in general, and maybe the debt ceiling. This is something we vote on pretty regularly. We raise the debt ceiling. I'm not sure a lot of Americans quite understand it. And there is I had to point out that the Republicans who voted in the Senate, who voted to raise the debt ceiling, they maybe took some heat from right-wing Twitter and Breitbart and whatnot. But I have to point out, it's easy for us in the House to vote against that because we know it's going to pass. A little bit more difficult in the Senate, where you got to be adults about it. And you can't have a default on the debt. And maybe explain to people what happens if you don't raise the debt ceiling. Because it's different than shutting down the government. And I'm not sure people understand the distinction there. It's one thing to shut down the government. I don't think people really notice that one. It's not exactly the end of the world when we just decide to stop funding the government. It's quite another thing to stop funding the payments on our bonds. And that's a difference.
Right. A government shutdown, what we call a government shutdown, is really just about 15% of federal programs temporarily stop operating. Mandatory programs continue. Mandatory programs like Social Security and anti-poverty programs and Medicare continue going. Defense keeps going. Anything vital keeps going. During one of those other government shutdowns, maybe about 10 to 15% of the discretionary programs pause. When you don't raise the debt limit, the government runs out of authority to borrow money. The problem is right now, when you're like this year, when nearly half of the government is funded by borrowing because taxes are only funding about 50 or 55% of the government. If you can't borrow the other 45 cents on the dollar, you have to stop paying bills for 45% of the government. This can be very dangerous, especially if you start to default on our bonds. If you don't pay bondholders who lent the government money, you're defaulting. The danger of default is those great 1.5% interest rates the government is borrowing at right now quickly become 5, 7, 8, 9% interest rates moving forward because you just scared the heck out of the bond market. You also have, again, depending on what gets paid, you could have Social Security checks not going out, Medicare providers not getting paid, troops not getting benefits. I think the better answer to the debt limit is not to not raise it, but to do what we've done historically, which is use the debt limit as an opportunity to enact reforms to actually fix the debt long term. Between 1985 and 2011, there were 7 major deficit reduction bills. All 7 were attached to debt limit increases. Mm-hmm. That's the proper way to use the debt limit. You actually have to fix the underlying problem.
Yeah, and that is the proper way. It's sort of historically how at least Republicans have advocated for it. Okay, we're going to vote on the debt limit. We'll vote to increase it because we do want to. We have to, but let's, like you said, use it as a negotiating tool to implement some fixes to the underlying problems. Obviously, those fixes haven't gone all that far because we still find ourselves in a massive debt problem, which kind of gets to the next question. I mean, how much? This is what normal people don't understand because they've been getting told since the 60s and 70s that too much debt's going to ruin our country, and we seem to be borrowing along, just going along just fine. We're just whistling past that graveyard until we fall off of a cliff. The problem is we don't really know when we'll fall off a cliff. And how do you persuade people that excessive debt is indeed a bad thing and that it might harm our long-term growth?
Yeah, I mean, I think the problem right now is people have gotten complacent because they don't realize the debt that's about to hit us. Right now, the debt held by the public is $23 trillion. However, just the baseline over the next 30 years is we're going to borrow $112 trillion. And that's the rosy scenario that assumes the tax cuts expire, all the stimulus spending expires, nothing from Biden gets passed, low interest rates, no wars, no recessions. The rosy scenario is $112 trillion over 30 years. This is going to be the biggest debt avalanche in world history. And we haven't felt it too much yet because it's just starting. But the danger is it's going to get so big that at a certain point, the bond market is going to get nervous. And they're going to say, we don't know if we want to lend you money because we don't know if you're good for this. Then they start to demand higher interest rates to compensate for the risk. And here's the scary part. Every point interest rates rise above the CBO projection over 30 years would cost $30 trillion in additional interest payments for 1 point. $30 trillion. So you get to the point if interest rates rise 2 points over CBO, that's $60 trillion. What we have to do in our challenge is to get people to focus on that now rather than wait for it to happen. You don't want to wait for a debt crisis to occur. The time to do it is before then. And there's a lot of complacency. The one thing that gives me hope is a parallel to global warming. Young people know with global warming, these are long-term issues. You don't look at the temperature now. You look long-term. We need to get them to think the same about debt.
Yeah, and I guess maybe go into a little bit more detail there. What happens if that, because that's a positive feedback loop that you described, where the debt becomes too great, the interest rates then go up because investors want more return for that. Now, what is a riskier bond? Which makes the debt go up more, and it's this positive feedback loop. And then what? Do they just stop buying it? Is that really the danger when people just stop buying the bonds?
Yeah, the danger is that the financial markets essentially cut us off, or that they basically again require 6, 7, 8% that we just can't pay. At that point, your options are either massive fiscal consolidation, which is to say huge tax hikes and spending cuts like nothing you've ever seen, or the printing press. At that point, you just may need the Federal Reserve to just start printing the amount of money they need every year. But when you're talking about $112 trillion over 30 years, or what's going to be even much more than that with higher interest rates, that's when you start to look at hyperinflation concerns. So all the options are bad at that point.
What do you say to Democrats if they point to Japan and they say, look, they've got a debt to GDP ratio over 200%. I mean, we can keep going. If they can keep going, we can keep going. I'm not sure what's China's debt to GDP ratio. I think it's also pretty high.
It's pretty, yeah. I mean, it's up there. The three that are higher than us right now are Greece, Italy, and Japan. Greece has already had a debt crisis. Italy is heading for a debt crisis. Japan is actually a cautionary tale. They're at 200% of GDP. However, they've also had 30 years of sluggish economic growth that haven't worked out very well for Japan. They're also able to finance their debt through astronomical savings rates. In fact, corporate retained earnings in Japan are 89% of GDP. corporate retained earnings, which means corporations in Japan are sitting on an amount of money that's 89% the size of their economy. That makes it a lot easier to lend that money to the government to spend. We don't have that parallel in America. We don't have that many savings. We're going to have to go out into the financial markets and raise interest rates and take it out of investment spending. You don't want to copy Japan, and we can't copy Japan. Furthermore, we're in a worse position than Japan because much of their debt was short-term investments and stimulus policies that they actually started leveling off in the last 10 years. Our debt is Social Security, Medicare, and entitlements that are going to be growing exponentially and that are going to be much harder to cut off. So ultimately, our deficits in 20 to 30 years are going to be well beyond the annual deficits Japan had even at their peak.
So explain the economic theory in practical terms, how excessive debt leads to that stagnating economic growth and eventually lower per capita GDP.
Sure. The big issue is an economy has a certain number of savings available for investments, business investments that create economic growth, home loans, car loans, student loans. That all comes out of savings. But the more government borrows up those savings to pay for Social Security and Medicare, the less money is available for business loans, again, for home loans, for car loans. Those are the lifeblood of economic growth. Those are the investments that make us more productive. When you have less money going into pro-growth investments because it's all paying for Social Security and Medicare, the economy starts to shrink a little bit.
It's hard for people to make that connection though, because I don't think your average person, like I have a hard time making the connection because I don't think your average person understands how it's either or, right? Because I mean, we pay for Social Security and Medicare. Yeah, it comes out of our debt. It doesn't mean that there's not Wall Street money flowing into, business X necessarily, does it? And it doesn't mean that it's harder for a business, just because we have excessive debt, doesn't mean that it's harder for a business to get a loan from Bank of America.
Over time, that can become the case. Right now, we have been somewhat bailed out by higher. So there have been a couple factors that have kind of bailed out higher savings rates in the short term. There was what's called a global savings glut, where there's a lot more savings coming out of Asia that's helped. There's also been more savings from baby boomers because they save when they're heading towards retirement. The issue is the global savings glut looks like it's coming to an end. And as baby boomers retire, they're going to start drawing down those savings. When you combine that with the government having to borrow $112 trillion over 30 years, you can get to the point where we're not awash in savings anymore. There's actually more and more demand for these savings, and that's when you start to see interest rates inch back up. And when interest rates are rising, that's telling you that there's not enough money for all the investments and the price is rising. You don't see it right now, but again, we're kind of on the precipice right now, and I think you're going to see that over time. It's dangerous to assume that just because interest rates are low now, they'll stay low forever. They fluctuate over time, and those factors will eventually start to push them upwards, and it will take a bite out of the economy.
Right. Okay. So, and that's helpful. I mean, all these different pressures cause interest rates to rise, which very does clearly have an effect on investments, and which clearly has an effect on growth. Sometimes I just feel like sometimes I have to translate the smart economic talk into something that I can understand. And therefore the audience can understand. I know you got to go at 4:30, so that was a quick one, but it was that was an in-depth one. I think we got a lot of good information in that. So Brian, I really appreciate your time. Thanks for being on and educating us about the policy wonky issues of the debt.
It's a depressing topic, so I appreciate the opportunity to go on and help people anyway understand it.
Absolutely. Thanks for being on.
Thank you.